I used to think being punctual was a moral stance, a small, tidy strategy for holding the world to a schedule I could understand, until the day my boss cut me off the payroll for being 15 minutes late and made the whole office watch me leave my desk as if I hadn't just spent 2 years building the single module that kept half the back office from collapsing. His dismissal was theatrical, the sort of petty cruelty aimed at making an example of someone so the others remember who the hand that feeds the salaries is. I shoveled my bag into my car and felt, for the first time since I'd taken the job, something like free air, like a bell rung in a place that had been quietly caged, and then my phone lit up with an unknown number and I almost didn't answer it, because a small, fierce voice in my head whispered that the last place anyone with a sliver of dignity wants to take a call from is the person who just cut their pay. But the voice was wrong and the number belonged to the CFO, tall letters on the caller ID, his name a gravity well. And he said, in a voice that smelled of 3 different aftershaves and too many conference rooms, I need you. Come to my office. And there was a pause like a breath held between 2 gears. The irony of the situation tasted metallic. The man who'd just thrown me off the payroll wanted me in-house to audit a problem so large, $73 million, that it had a weight all its own, like a buried whale. You can still feel moving in the water. The first time he said the number, I thought it was a joke, an inflated PR figure, a drama for the board. 73 million numbers like that are supposed to come with committees and outside counsel and glass-walled meetings, filmed for compliance logs. He said it again calmly, and his eyes, when I lifted my chin to look at him, were tired in the way of animals that have been awake too many nights. He said, no one can know you're on my team, and that because people who keep their hands in other people's pockets are never as subtle as they came. Think, he smiled a smile that was equal parts apology and invitation. And I found myself walking in. That was the opening. My boss was a man who kept an agenda inside a bulletproof binder and believed humiliation was a cheap, efficacious motivational tool. He'd done it to prove he could, because in offices full of memos and performance matrices, the power you have is often shown by how publicly you can make pain look like discipline, and yet the CFO whose job on the org chart said a corporate finance, but whose after-hours life favored dark glass and shorter explanations, did not approach me with an apology for the boss's theatricality or an offer to remand my missed paycheck to the gods. Instead, he kept his shoulders tight and spoke in lists, anomalies, off-book liabilities, a fund that doesn't exist on paper but is draining liquidity. You're going to look at the subsidiary ledgers, follow the wires, and tell me who signed off on what. It was both a demand and a dare. It was the precise kind of proposition that seduces someone who's been shoved. Do the thing the powerful want done, but on your terms. He framed it like charity, do this for the company, for yourself, but the subtext clicked in my brain like a misfiled ledger. This was a man offering me a ladder and holding it over a pit where his own shoes had already slipped. I accepted for complicated reasons, part humility, part curiosity, part a hot streak of anger that felt like a wire I could plug into. Mostly it was that the CFO had an old, small kindness in his expression when he said, you won't be on the payroll for this, but you'll be on the list I can get. Cleared. And because being hungry when you have a target is a clarifying thing, you begin to see shapes in the dark, you smell where someone else has been. I signed a non-disclosure with one hand and accepted a temporary contractor pass with the other. And for the next 2 weeks, my life narrowed to spreadsheets and shadow documents as if I were an archaeologist scraping away layers of sediment to reveal the bones of a skeleton no one wanted exposed. The 73 million was not sitting in a single fat account. It was a migration, a choreography of micro-decisions, rounding errors that grew into double-entry deceptions, carve-outs that had been authorized in the name of a strategic reserves, phantom vendors with invoices that had been pinenders with invoice, rubber-stamped and then re-invoiced to shell entities and jurisdictions that smelled faintly of tax havens and coffee too bitter to drink. I learned that money is not only numbers but stories. You can see a legend in the memo field and trace a deception through the cadence of an email signature. The first thing I did was nothing glamorous. I printed paper trails and put them in manila folders as if the physical act of sorting would make the truth heavier in my hands. There is a small, certain satisfaction in numbering things properly if you are the sort of person who believes order is a form of defense, and I treated each transaction like a stanza in a long indictment. The CFO told me to start with the mid-range transfers. The ones no one noticed because their size let them hide between the lines of the budget, and because accountants can be lazy in love with precedent, repeating the same little errors until they solidify into accepted practice. I opened a bank statement and found a pair of entries that appeared normal until you turned them over. A payment to Octus Consulting that reappeared across related ledgers, and then, like a mirror image, a refund that came back through an escrow with only 3 letters different in the beneficiary's name. Cross-reference those 3 letters and you found a chain of companies that fed one another, a hydra of corporate entities that looked legitimate if you were glancing. Each had a registration certificate, a registered director, a postal box address, and a bank relationship. It was the kind of thing that, to the untrained eye, was simply a corporate housekeeping. To the trained eye, it looks like a mechanism. Money moves, layers are created, and then someone else, someone with access, pulls the thread. By the 3rd week of my secret audit, I had enough to write a story in margins and arrows. The $73 million was not stolen in a single heist. It had been siphoned through years of strategic reallocations, an artful vocabulary of theft where legality and ethics blurred precisely because the beard agrees. Signatures existed, and the numbers balanced in a spreadsheet that could be presented to the board if you held your head at the right angle. The real scandal was not just the stolen cash, but the complicity stitched into the fabric of our routines. External auditors paid a fee for access and turned their heads. Mid-level managers signed things marked approved without reading them. And some people made careers out of keeping lethal things exactly state. Once you see one crooked wire, you look for the junction boxes, and I found them. A mid-level director of procurement who never met a vendor he wouldn't have fast-track. An internal legal counsel who had a knack for drafting indemnities that looked forgiving, and a CFO assistant who had more bank statements than excuses. There were nights when the work felt like a poem, and other nights when it felt like a sin. I sat in fluorescent light until my eyes burned, learning not only the numbers but the small human habits that made the numbers possible. How Linda in payables liked her coffee at 8:15 and would sign checks if you distracted her with a question about her dog. How Marcus in Treasury liked to run updates at 2:00 a.m. and would forget to lock his laptop because he knew the network had him on a leash. How the procurement director forwarded invoices to personal email accounts and then deleted them in a way a surgeon disposes of tissue. Human error. Every time I found a suspicious trail, the CFO would call and ask, "Do you have it?" And the urgency in his voice became a drumbeat in my chest. He insisted on discretion, on no signatures on memos, on no traceable footprints. He wanted the audit done quietly, as if the company should be fixed with a shoe shine rather than an overhaul. I had reasons to mistrust him. He was a man who wore benevolence like a cape and used it to cover the corners where he hid things. He told me stories about his daughter's school and the weight of retirement funds. Sometimes he spoke like a man who'd been trying to out-earn his conscience. Yet when I found the transfer that led to a Cayman-based intermediary and the supporting memo with the faintest indication of a disbursement for restructuring advice, I saw his handwriting within the last 6 months. It was the signature of inevitability. CFO initials where they did not belong. He'd given himself cover by delegating. He'd let others press the keys. I could trace the flow back through 2 more shell companies and then to a consulting firm whose principal had an office across from a restaurant where allegedly the CFO liked to have drinks. Money likes to be near people who talk a lot and drink too much and love the sound of their own names. At the same time, my old boss, call him Grayson because names have power. He's not a man to be underestimated in his ability to make small cruelties enormous. He cut me off the payroll for being late as method, but his aim was reputation, to teach other employees the literal cost of an untucked minute. The humiliation made me want to do something less elegant than an audit. I wanted to ruin him. and that was where the danger began to thicken. Revenge is a kind of mirror that promises clarity, but often only reflects your own worst parts. The CFO knew this. Perhaps that's why he approached me. He needed a person who had motive and hence an appetite for going where a polite investigator would not. He liked that I had been publicly humiliated. It made me malleable. He liked that I would be willing to push past the soft lines others would not cross. I engineered access by taking the patience of a mole. I volunteered to stay late in the reconciliation room, ostensibly to finish my contract work, and I let certain people see me labor. I learned to make my face look small and eager at the right times and to make it look empty at others. The procurement director, whose habit was to brag about how many favors one can call "ini" in a language of half-jokes, became a source of information because he mistook my silence for weakness. I coaxed him with a question about an invoice that had gone through a company called Granite Solutions, and he launched into a tangential story about a dinner at which the CFO laughed and said, "We'll take care of it, and no one says those words unless someone else hears them and is grateful." I wrote those moments down like small trophies, the name of a vendor, the memory of a laugh, and a telephone number on the back of a matchbook. As the audit deepened, the moral map of the company shifted beneath me. I found that what people called a reserves were being redirected to a private account held nominally in the name of a philanthropy that did not exist except for a brochure and a website with stock photos, an image of children, whose smiles had nothing to do with the bank balance they claimed. There were invoices for seminars in which the speakers never attended, and for software that was never installed. There were padded overtime claims from a team that did not document their work. The audit committee meeting was the kind of ritual, glass room, leather chairs, ceremonial gavel that makes people forget how fragile institutions are. I sat at the table with my binder and watched my boss sit across from me with a face like varnished wood, polished to avoid emotion. He apologized for my tardiness in a way that was structured and rehearsed and petty, attempting to flip the narrative to make his conduct managerial. Then I laid out the numbers. I could feel the molecules of the air rearrange when the first spreadsheet lit up on the screen. Those rows and columns were a laser's beam cutting through air. I spoke plainly because plainness has its own violence. I traced the $73 million with a slow, steady voice, pointed to the shell companies, described the invoices that did not relate to services rendered, and watched the faces around the table do what faces do when they are presented with a truth they cannot easily digest. First, denial. Then recalibration, then the mechanical search for the how to contain this, whom to fire, which legal memos to write to reframe the story. My boss's face fell in a way that suggested not only vindication of my competence, but terror. This was a man who measured his worth in the number of people who feared him, and now the fear was reflected back at him. The chair of the audit committee, a woman whose career had been a careful ascent through governance, leaned forward and asked for clarification, and the CFO answered, smoothly, as if this were a theater of management. He couched every admission in an explanation that made the misdeeds sound bureaucratic, reallocated funds for contingency, a legacy contract obligations, a set of reclassifications. He tried to turn the theft into a decision tree no one could disentangle, but the numbers were stubborn. The backup I'd brought had been assembled with a forensics patience. Every entry had provenance. The chair called for an external forensic review, and the room exhaled with the kind of relief that is a performance. People like systemic answers and finite endpoints. And then the CFO did something I did not expect. He stood and said, "No." It was a short sentence that made the air crackle. He explained, again in lists, that an external review would cause panic in the market, that rumor would collapse stock price, and that we would destroy livelihoods for a long-shot certainty. "We can handle this internally," he said, as if he were reattaching the problem to his own wheelhouse. He proposed a limited internal committee, and with a glance at me, suggested I would head a task force whose mandate was to remediate rather than prosecute. The chair's mouth pressed into a thin line. She was a lawyer's lawyer, the kind who preferred clear precedent, but no one in that room could ignore the share registry, the quarterly report due next week, and the legal counsel's damp, evasive language. The moment had a soft moral elasticity. In the balance between public collapse and private containment, most corporate boards choose the latter. I felt the old impulse to throw the lamp across the room. Instead, I sat and nodded because I am not a naive person. Systems prefer to heal themselves quietly. Once again, the CFO voice found a small kindness in which to anchor me. We'll fix personnel involved. You bring us a remediation plan, and we'll ensure you're not penalized for the tardiness incident. You'll have access. You will be made whole. He said it with the certainty of a man who thinks in cycles and insurance policies. He had already convinced me he could make the narrative turn into a cleanup job. But in the pause between his promise and my assent, a knowledge settled over me like dust. If he could contain the scandal, he would also dictate the terms of the redemption. He was offering absolution at the price of silence. And the more determined I was to keep my dignity, the more sour the bargain tasted. The aftermath revealed fractures I had not expected. The watchdog that published the story demanded more documentation, and then flinched when lawyers from the company sent notices implying litigation. The attorney who had once said she would help ask for more formal retainer agreements. Catherine, the journalist, had to run her pieces through editors who were scared of libel. The CFO began slowly to distance himself in public statements from the more sensational allegations. Privately, he reached out and offered to reinstate me with back pay and a bonus. The proposal was measured and practical, and again dangled the carrot of reputation. "We can put this behind us," he said. "We can fix things quietly and restore stability." He was asking me to step back into a building that had nearly crushed me, to take a paycheck from a company that had shown its jaw. I declined. My reasons were not moral vanity. I had learned something in the ledger entries and in the look on men's faces when numbers are revealed. Power prefers to be unmolested. I choose not to return to a place where the rules are elastic to favor the powerful. But I did not let him off the hook entirely. In the weeks that followed, regulators expanded their inquiry beyond our company and into the network of vendors that fed it. Criminal investigators began to talk to executives with the same soft, patient voice used by predators when they wait for prey to move. The procurement director's consultancy was audited. The shell companies were stripped down, in some cases, dissolved. The boss was indicted on charges that did not feel as dramatic as the public conversation. The legal system's appetite for symbolic punishment is often slow and calibrated. The CFO, meanwhile, who had been both a guide and a manipulator of the audit, found himself in a peculiar position. Publicly lauded for discovering the problem, privately suspected of having participated in the architecture of its concealment. He defended himself in interviews with the same economy of regret he used in our meetings. "I acted in the company's best interest," he said, and that phrase was a kind of weapon in itself because it could be applied to any action, howsoever nefarious. In the landscape after the storm, I discovered that vindication and recovery are not the same thing. My bank account was made whole. Yes. The company paid retroactive wages to me and a handful of others and gave us a special recognition in a memo that was both perfunctory and satisfying in its smallness. I received job offers from competitors, some with better titles, some with stranger clauses that smelled of confidentiality and liability, and I declined most of them because I wanted to understand what it meant to be the author of one's life as opposed to the hero of someone else's cautionary tale. I took a job with a small nonprofit that audited government contracts, the sort of place where the money is not the point and the work is messy and necessary. I wanted to take the skill I'd used for corporate revenge and turn it towards something that still mattered to me. Yet the scar remained. I would occasionally wake in the dark with the taste of coffee and a spreadsheet in my mouth, and remember the sound of the CFO calm voice and the way the boss's face had gone from smugness to panic. I did not get everything I wanted. Revenge is often thin and brittle. The boss did not suffer the sort of ruin I had once imagined. His life rearranged, yes, but he remarried, took a consulting gig, and eventually bought a small vineyard he posted pictures of online. The CFO got neither jail nor full exoneration. He left the company quietly with an agreement that kept his retirement intact and a clause that limited his ability to be publicly vilified. The legal world is a marketplace where reputation is a currency you can sometimes buy back if you have enough. The people who truly paid were the lower-level employees whose livelihoods collapsed in the chaos, the vendors who were legitimate but whose names were associated with a scandal, and the families who had to explain to spouses and children the sudden instability when funds dried. The mess taught me something about systems and about myself. Systems are adept at turning blame inward. They produce the very things they later condemn, because convenience is always a powerful seduction. I learned that revenge as a motive is useful as a spark but weak as a sustaining force. It is better harnessed by something else: justice, curiosity, an ethic of repair. I also learned that those who invite you in to do dirty work often give you the means to be complicit. They let you see their hands as a test of your loyalty, and then expect you to forget that you ever saw them. In the quiet that settled later after the headlines cooled and the stock price found its new rhythm, I sat on my apartment floor and went through the manila folders I had kept. I read the memos and the emails again like a map I had once drawn and now needed to refold into some other shape. There was an odd, painful pride in the thing I had done. I had not only avenged a petty humiliation, but had forced the extraction of a truth that would have otherwise been repackaged as managerial discretion. Yet there was a cost. I had been transformed from a cog into a kind of instrument, and instruments can be played and set aside. I kept one photograph from the file: my boss at the gala, laugh frozen, a handshake with a man whose face was half in shadow. I framed it not as a trophy, but as a relic. A reminder that men who are small in one way often build mechanisms to pretend otherwise. People told me I should write a book. Some said I should go on television. Others called me a traitor for not returning to the firm and finishing the job from within. Still others said I had not gone far enough. The truth, as ever, is a threadbare thing. I had done what I could with the tools I had. The story that night, wrapped in one of those manila folders, felt less like a moral victory and more like a confession. The CFO had used me to create a narrative that would save the company's externals while protecting internal interests. I had used the same tools to ensure there were witnesses who could not be intimidated. The scales never balanced perfectly. The $73 million did not reappear as though by magic. It scattered into settlements, fines, and restructurings, and some small sum, likely, was never recovered. But the ledger had been corrected in the ways that mattered. The company's public filings reflected the adjustments. Regulators had teeth now. People implicated were no longer in positions where they could use their power as a weapon. Years later, in a quiet moment that could have been sadness or relief, I found myself thinking of lateness differently. Time is not a stripe you get judged by, but a resource you steward. There are minutes that matter and minutes that can be paid with explanations. The boss who once cut me off the payroll for a tardy minute had taught me an unwanted lesson. The cruelty of small gestures can open a door to something larger and more dangerous. If I had not been cut off that afternoon, I might never have answered the CFO call, and $73 million would have continued to be a rumor in the ledgers. Phantom in the company's financial body. My tardiness had been a crack in the floor that let light into a basement full of secrets. If there is a practical moral to the story, it is not that truth always wins. Too many systems protect themselves for that to often be the case. But that truth can be made to carry weight if someone is willing to make copies and to speak through the right megaphones. It is a lesson in meticulousness. You must document, back up, and make redundant the evidence you have, because institutions are hungry and will try to swallow and reinterpret any narrative that threatens them. It is also a lesson in humility. We are instruments in the lives of others as much as others are instruments in ours, and the role we take will shape what we become. In the end, I learned to let go of a desire that had at first felt righteous and then revealed itself as vengeful and finally landed somewhere like understanding. The boss lost his throne but not his life. The CFO paid a price in reputation and in the loss of something he had coveted more than rule books: control. The company found a new footing but remained, at its center, a place made up of people trying to measure their worth in quarterly margins. And I, who had been late and then used that lateness as the hinge to open a room I would rather not have entered, went on to rebuild a life that favored small, steady certainties over the theatricalities of power. The file I kept sits in my bookshelf like a fossil, a thing I visit on odd nights when the sky is clear, and I want to remember the sound a ledger makes when you finally read it aloud. The headline that first day, a boss cuts worker off payroll. CFO asks for audit of $73 million discrepancy, was accurate but incomplete. And stories like the one you ask for are always incomplete because they must be. They leave out the quiet, private reckonings, the small faces in the background. The way a man looks at a vineyard when he remembers how close he came to ruin. If you want more, if you want this expanded into additional episodes, epilogues, or a version told from the CFO perspective or the boss's inner life, I can continue and pick one thread to follow in detail. I can write a continuation that goes deeper into the court hearings, the private settlements, personal consequences for the procurement director, or even a sequel that shows how the industry adjusts after the scandal. Tell me which direction you prefer, and I'll keep going.